The insult didn't come wrapped in humor. It came flat, quiet, and surgical, delivered in the middle of a live training lane, while American observers stood close enough to hear every word. The British operator didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply lifted the American rucksack with one hand, let it hang there for a moment, and then let it drop back into the dust. Too heavy. He said it the way a doctor might say terminal. Around him, the desert training ground stretched into a blinding horizon of heat, shimmer, and wind-cut earth. It was supposed to be a demonstration of Allied strength, joint integration between the world's most powerful military and the world's most quietly feared one. American Special Operations personnel, equipped with the latest doctrine, the latest technology, the latest everything, had arrived ready to prove efficiency. Instead, they were being dissected. The man who dropped the pack belonged to the Special Air Service. The SAS did not posture. They did not advertise. They did not explain themselves. They simply survived. And survival, in their doctrine, had rules. He crouched beside the American kit again, pulling at straps, untipping attachments, examining carabiners, tools, redundancies stacked on redundancies. There was nothing cheap about it. Every component represented millions in research, thousands of hours in development, layers of institutional confidence, and yet, in his hands, it looked like doubt. Too much, he said, not an opinion. A verdict. The American operator watching him felt it land like a personal insult, because it was. This wasn't about preference, this was about philosophy. The Americans came from a system built on overwhelming capability. Since the mid-20th century, the United States Army had refined warfare into a science of dominance, more firepower, more protection, more support. Logistics chains that could feed entire divisions across oceans, equipment designed not just to fight, but to guarantee advantage. The numbers told the story. American special operators often carried between 90 and 120 pounds of gear on extended missions. The SAS carried closer to 60, sometimes less. The difference wasn't comfort, it was a belief, because every extra pound solved one problem while quietly creating another. Speed, noise, fatigue, survival. The British operator reached down and picked up the American body armor next. Thick ceramic plates, maximum protection. He tapped it once with his knuckle, solid, safe, and then he said the one thing no one in the American contingent expected to hear. "If you need this much protection," he said calmly, "you're already in the wrong place." It was the kind of statement that violated doctrine. American military culture, particularly after Vietnam, had evolved toward risk reduction. Protect the soldier, engineer away vulnerability, replace uncertainty with systems. The SAS had evolved differently. Their institutional memory stretched back through Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Oman, the jungles of Malaya campaigns where protection wasn't something you wore. It was something you became. Protection was movement. Protection was silence. Protection was not there when the enemy struck back. And here, in the dust of a joint exercise, those two belief systems were standing face to face. Watching nearby were operators from Delta Force, America's own most elite counter-terror unit, men who had spent their careers refining lethality to a razor's edge, even though they were quiet, because this wasn't a casual rivalry. This was professional recognition and a professional challenge. The exercise itself was simple on paper. Long-range infiltration, surveillance, extraction. But simplicity on paper has never survived contact with terrain. By hour 6, the weight difference was already writing its story. American operators moved with precision, but slower. Their boots struck the ground heavier. Their breathing came harder under the load. Tiny sounds carried in the still air fabric, friction, equipment shifting, the mechanical whisper of advanced gear doing exactly what it had been designed to do. The SAS patrol ahead was almost invisible. They flowed instead of marching. Their webbing was stripped down to essentials: ammunition, water, medical, radio, nothing extra, nothing comforting, nothing forgiving, because forgiveness had weight, and weight had consequences. This difference wasn't theoretical, it was measurable. Fatigue studies showed that every additional 10 pounds of carried load reduced movement speed by up to 7% over extended terrain. 7% didn't sound like much, until it was the difference between clearing a danger zone and dying inside it. The American command structure knew this data. They had funded the research themselves, and yet their operators still carried more because their doctrine didn't just fight the enemy, it fought uncertainty itself. More gear meant more options. More options meant more control, at least in theory. But theory had a way of collapsing under heat and distance. Back at staging, as the exercise paused, one American NCO finally asked the question that had been building like pressure in a sealed chamber. "You really think our gear's a liability?" The SAS operator didn't answer immediately. He took a drink from his canteen. Warm water, no cooling system, no enhancements, just water. Then he looked at the American and shrugged. "It depends," he said, "on whether you plan on being seen." There was no malice in it. That was the worst part, because it meant he believed it completely. Around them, two military superpowers stood on the same ground, wearing different answers to the same question. One believed survival came from engineering superiority. The other believed survival came from needing less. Both had proof. Both had ghosts. And neither was willing to admit they might be wrong, because somewhere, beyond training grounds and exercises, beyond budgets and doctrine papers, beyond pride and identity, men would carry these decisions into real war, and the weight they chose would decide whether they came back. Long before a single rifle cracked in the desert night, before a single American boot hit the sand beside a British one, the clash had already begun. It lived in filing cabinets and procurement boards, in war colleges and budget hearings, in two very different answers to the same question: what wins wars, the machine or the man? On one side stood a military superpower forged in industrial fire. The United States had learned its most defining lesson in the furnaces of the Second World War. When American factories outproduced entire continents, when Liberty ships slid into the Atlantic faster than U-boats could sink them, when mechanized columns stretched from Normandy to the Rhine like rivers of steel, a doctrine crystallized: overwhelm, dominate, outproduce, outlast. Technology was not merely support, it was strategy. Logistics was not a detail, it was destiny. By the time the Cold War calcified global tensions, that belief had hardened into institutional DNA. Satellite reconnaissance, stealth bombers, carrier strike groups, encrypted battle networks. The United States didn't just field units, it fielded ecosystems. An American operation rarely moved alone. It arrived with ESR overhead, medevac on standby, drone coverage, air superiority, and a logistical tail so vast it could feed small cities. Redundancy was insurance. Precision-guided munitions were reassuring. If something failed, something else was already spinning up. This was not arrogance. It was arithmetic. In Desert Storm, coalition air forces flew more than 100,000 sorties in weeks. Smart bombs struck command bunkers through ventilation shafts. GPS-guided artillery erased Iraqi positions with mathematical cruelty. Casualty ratios tilted so violently that analysts struggled to process them. The American way of war had demonstrated that technological supremacy could compress time, shrink risk, and break conventional armies before they could even see their attacker. And then there was the other philosophy: smaller island, smaller budget, smaller footprint, but an institutional memory steeped in improvisation. The British Army's mythology does not begin in air-conditioned operations centers. It begins in the dust of North Africa with the long-range Desert Group and the men who would become the Special Air Service. It begins with patrol vehicles modified by hand, with stripped-down jeeps racing through dunes under starlight, with demolition charges placed by operators who knew that if the plan failed, there would be no cavalry coming over the horizon. The SAS was born in scarcity. It learned to treat technology as a tool, not a crutch. Radios failed, resupply was uncertain, air cover was not guaranteed. So doctrine evolved around something less tangible but infinitely adaptable: human judgment. Initiative. individual autonomy. In the North African campaign, British raiders from formations like the Desert Rats adapted daily to sand-clogged engines and shifting axis lines. They survived not by superior equipment, but by improvisation. A cut fuel line became a field repair problem, not a mission abort. A lost navigation marker became a recalculated bearing under unfamiliar stars. When they infiltrated enemy airfields and destroyed dozens of aircraft on the ground, they did so with limited support and absolute reliance on the man next to them. That pattern never disappeared. In the Falklands War, thousands of miles from home, British forces fought in conditions so inhospitable that even basic movement became a trial. Freezing rain cut sideways across peat bogs. Helicopter support was limited. Equipment had to be carried across brutal terrain because there was simply no other option. Units learned quickly that weight could kill. Every extra pound slowed you. Every unnecessary dependency increased vulnerability. Minimalism wasn't aesthetic, it was survival. Then came operations like Bravo 20 during the Gulf War. An 8-man SAS patrol inserted deep into Iraqi territory to hunt Scud launchers. The mission would become controversial, debated, dissected, mythologized. But at its core was a revealing constant, a tiny unit operating in isolation, beyond reliable support, dependent almost entirely on navigation skill, physical endurance, and decision-making under catastrophic pressure. The patrol's struggles, freezing conditions, compromised positions, desperate evasion attempts underscored something raw. When systems fail, when extraction collapses, when communication breaks down, what remains is the operator. Not the network, not the satellite, the man. By the late 20th century, these philosophies had matured into two fully formed institutional cultures. In the American system, procurement committees analyzed data streams and threat matrices, funding next-generation platforms designed to dominate peer adversaries. Billions were allocated toward stealth technology, network-centric warfare, advanced optics, precision munitions. Training was rigorous, yes, but it existed within a technological scaffold. The assumption was clear: superior tools reduce uncertainty. In the British Special Operations community, uncertainty was not something to be eliminated. It was something to be eliminated. It was something to be endured. Training emphasized adaptability under deprivation. Operators were conditioned to function with minimal kit, to operate in small autonomous elements, to improvise when orders became irrelevant. Where American doctrine often sought to engineer predictability, British SOF cultivated comfort in chaos. Neither philosophy was naive. American commanders understood that technology multiplied force. A single JTAC with laser designation and air support could reshape an entire battlefield. Night vision turned darkness into advantage. Secure communications allowed real-time coordination across continents. Why rely solely on human instinct when machines could extend perception beyond natural limits? British operators countered quietly. What happens when the battery dies, when GPS is jammed, when extraction is denied, when the mission morphs in ways doctrine never predicted? This wasn't nationalism. It was doctrine. It was two answers to the same operational equation. One believed that preparation meant building the most advanced warfighting architecture ever conceived, a lattice of intelligence, firepower, and logistics so dense that failure became statistically unlikely. The other believed preparation meant stripping everything down until only the essentials remained: skill, endurance, trust, and independent decision-making. And for years these philosophies coexisted without friction. Joint operations in Iraq and Afghanistan saw American Special Operations Forces and British SAS units fight side by side. They respected each other. They admired each other. Americans recognized the surgical precision and quiet professionalism of the SAS. British operators respected the sheer scale and responsiveness of American support networks. But beneath the professionalism lingered a quiet tension, a subtle skepticism, a doctrinal question left unresolved. Is dominance engineered or embodied? In Afghanistan's high valleys, American units could call in drones within minutes, adjust airstrikes with digital tablets, and receive resupply by helicopter, even in hostile terrain. The logistical machine flexed like muscle. Meanwhile, British patrols often operated lighter, pushing deeper with fewer technological dependencies, placing faith in concealment and stealth rather than overwatch saturation. When mission succeeded, each side saw validation. The Americans pointed to reduced casualty rates, to precision strikes that avoided collateral damage. The British pointed to flexibility, to operations completed without the electromagnetic signature of a small city broadcasting its presence. And then the battlefield began to change. Adversaries adapted. They studied satellite patterns. They experimented with jamming. They learned to exploit predictability in technologically dense operations. Meanwhile, the proliferation of cheap drones and encrypted communications began leveling the playing field. The monopoly on advanced tools was eroding. Suddenly, the philosophical debate wasn't academic. If your strength lies in systems, what happens when systems degrade? If your strength lies in human adaptability, what happens when the scale of war demands industrial capacity? Two armies, two philosophies, one evolving battlefield. The clash wasn't new. It had been simmering since North Africa, through the Falklands, through Gulf deserts and Afghan mountains. But something specific, a moment, an operation, a convergence of doctrine and reality, was about to force the debate into the open. Not in a conference room, but under fire. The criticism did not begin with mockery. It began with a sound, a dull, rhythmic clatter in the darkness of a half-collapsed compound outside Basra. Ceramic plates tapping against buckles, cables brushing polymer, carabiners kissing metal rails. It was the sound of weight moving before the men did. And to the operators watching from the shadows, that sound was not just noise, it was time leaking away. This was the first revelation. The trial was not about fashion, it was about seconds. The first piece of equipment under scrutiny was body armor. American doctrine in Iraq and Afghanistan had evolved under the constant pressure of improvised explosive devices and mass casualty ambushes. The solution was logical: increase survivability. Add plates, add coverage. Protect the lateral torso, protect the groin, protect the deltoids. If fragmentation was everywhere, then armor must be everywhere too. By 2007, a fully equipped American infantryman in Iraq could be carrying 60 to 80 pounds before ammunition was even counted. In Afghanistan's mountains, that number often crept beyond 100 pounds once water, batteries, optics, and mission-specific tools were added. On paper, survivability rates improved. Fatalities from torso wounds dropped significantly compared to earlier conflicts. Medical evacuation windows expanded. More soldiers lived to reach surgical teams. But to certain British Special Air Service operators who had operated in the same environments under different constraints, the armor solution looked like a paradox. They measured weight differently, not in pounds, in reaction time. Every additional 10 pounds, they argued, translated into measurable degradation in sprint acceleration, lateral movement, and drop-to-prone speed. Under controlled testing, soldiers wearing full-plate configurations showed reaction delays of fractions of a second when transitioning from movement to firing position. Fractions of a second in a firefight are not fractions, they are outcomes. In one after-action analysis from Helmand Province, an SAS troop commander described a contact initiated at under 40 meters. The enemy maneuvered through irrigation ditches. The British operators, running slick plate carriers with minimal side protection, moved low and fast through poppy fields. Across the canal, a partnered conventional unit struggled to clear a wall because climbing it required shedding packs first. By the time they repositioned, the insurgents had already exfiltrated. No one died in that engagement. But the lesson lingered. Protection had purchased survivability at the cost of mobility dominance, and mobility in small unit warfare is often the more lethal currency. Then came communications. American forces fielded some of the most advanced battlefield communication systems ever deployed. Encrypted radios, satellite uplinks, GPS integration, blue force tracking, real-time coordination across brigades. It was a networked war machine designed to eliminate fog. The rationale was institutional and powerful. Superior information reduces fratricide, improves coordination, enables overwhelming fire support. And it worked. Close air support integration reached unprecedented levels of precision. Units could call in artillery with digitized grids in seconds. But complexity breeds dependency. SAS teams, operating in smaller numbers and often outside large base infrastructure, favored leaner communications setups. One primary radio, one backup, minimal cabling, fewer protrusions. Why? Because wires snag, because antennae silhouette against skylines, because batteries die, and because when a system fails, a soldier trained to rely on layered digital redundancy may hesitate. In the heat of Baghdad's summer, where ambient temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, heat casualties rose sharply among heavily equipped units. Body armor trapped heat. Radios generated it. Extra batteries added more weight, more insulation. There were documented cases of heat exhaustion correlating with full mandated armor configurations during long patrols in high-temperature zones. The SAS critique was not that communications were unnecessary. It was the doctrine had drifted toward over-insurance. Every contingency layered another device. Every risk added another safeguard, until the soldier became a walking compromise. Then, optics. American units standardized equipment to ensure logistical consistency. Standard-issue optics meant standardized training, interchangeable parts, predictable maintenance cycles. From ACOGs to holographic sights, uniformity reduced supply chaos across thousands of troops. It was efficient at scale. But scale was the dividing line. SAS operators were known for customizing optics to individual shooting style, eyesight variation, and mission profile. A rifle setup for urban CQB differed from one intended for rural overwatch. Magnification levels shifted. Backup irons were adjusted personally. Mount heights altered cheek weld geometry. Customization created familiarity. Familiarity reduced cognitive load. When entering a darkened compound in Fallujah or Sangin, muscle memory determines survival. An optic that sits a few millimeters higher than preferred can alter split-second sight acquisition. American forces prioritized commonality. SAS prioritized intimacy with the weapon. Neither philosophy was wrong, but the contrast revealed something deeper. One system optimized for the institution. The other is optimized for the individual operator. Next came load-bearing systems. American troops often wore modular tactical vests capable of carrying everything required for extended engagements: extra magazines, grenades, tourniquets, radios, hydration systems, flex cuffs, night vision batteries, and more. The Molly webbing allowed near-infinite attachment configurations. The logic was sound. Be prepared. Carry what you might need. Resupply might not come, but load-bearing excess introduces two silent enemies: noise and inertia. A fully configured vest, when running, produces micro-collisions. Metal taps polymer. Plastic snaps against plates. Even when disciplined, equipment whispers. SAS teams often stripped their rigs of mission essentials. If an item was not required for the specific objective, it did not travel. In night operations, this minimalism paid dividends. In one account from southern Iraq, an SAS reconnaissance element crawled within 20 meters of an insurgent compound before initiating surveillance. The ground was dry, brittle. Every movement threatened to crackle. Minimal kit meant fewer friction points. Less drag against earth. Noise discipline is not a training slide. It is physics. And finally, footwear. It seemed trivial until it wasn't. American-issued boots were designed for durability and uniformity. They had to function in desert sand, Afghan rock, urban rubble. Procurement required standardization for millions of pairs. But standardization means compromise. SAS operators often purchased or modified boots tailored to terrain: lightweight assault boots for urban raids, aggressive lug soles for mountain climbs, flexible midsoles for rapid sprints. In Afghanistan's Korangal Valley, elevation changes punished heavy boots. Operators climbing steep goat trails at 8,000 feet measured exhaustion not just in breath, but in micro-delays. A heavier boot increases calf fatigue. Calf fatigue reduces sprint burst. Sprint burst determines whether you reach cover before rounds impact. One British veteran summarized it bluntly: if your boots slow you by half a second over 10 meters, that's half a second someone else uses. Across all these categories, armor, communications, optics, load-bearing systems, footwear, the pattern became undeniable. The American rationale was built on statistical survivability and institutional resilience. Protect more, connect more, carry more, standardize more. The SAS counter-argument was built on immediacy and maneuver dominance: move faster, decide quicker, customize deeper, carry less. Neither side was naive. American units faced casualty rates that forced political and military accountability. Armor mandates were responses to real deaths. Communication layers were reactions to real friendly fire incidents. Standardization allowed a global force to function coherently across continents. The SAS, by contrast, operated in smaller teams where individual proficiency and discretion were the primary multipliers. Their missions often required stealth insertion, short-duration violence, and rapid extraction. Two systems, two risk calculations, but the accumulation of evidence was uncomfortable. Each added pound equaled milliseconds lost. Each extra device risked noise. Each standardized compromise dulled personalization. Each mandate layered protection while quietly taxing aggression. The question was not whether American gear was advanced. It was whether, in certain fights, advancement had begun to crowd out agility. And in small unit warfare, agility is not style. It is survival. The trial was no longer about mockery. It was about doctrine under pressure. Because when equipment begins to dictate movement instead of enabling it, the battlefield delivers its own verdict. And that verdict is never theoretical. The fracture didn't reveal itself in a conference room or a procurement report. It surfaced in the dark. The Joint Task Force had assembled on the ragged edge of a desert plateau where the wind never stopped moving and the dust tasted like chalk. Officially, it was a high-readiness interoperability exercise, an integrated assault designed to test multinational cohesion under contested conditions. Unofficially, it was a quiet proving ground. A chance for two elite institutions, American Special Operations Forces and the men of the Special Air Service, to see, without ceremony, whose philosophy truly translated under pressure. The objective was simple on paper: a simulated hostile command node entrenched inside a mock village complex, defended by a layered air defense system, drone surveillance, and electronic interference. The timeline was unforgiving: infiltrate, seize, extract within a 2-hour window before a notional enemy mechanized column arrived. On the operations map, it looked elegant. American assault elements would advance in armored mobility, platforms heavy, communications rich, sensor laden. The British detachment would move separately, light and fast, linking up near phase line echo before the final push. Two doctrines, one battlefield. The Americans staged at 0101. Engines idled low, thermal sight scanning. Their vehicles carried everything: extra ammunition, breaching charges, encrypted communications relays, redundant navigation systems. The hum of generators and digital screens filled the dark like a mechanical heartbeat. Across the plateau, the SAS patrol moved almost invisibly. No vehicle signatures, no engine noise. Just boots, controlled breathing, and the soft clink of minimalist load-bearing rigs. Their equipment was lean by design: fewer batteries, fewer screens, fewer layers between operator and terrain. The first 20 minutes unfolded cleanly. American vehicles advanced along the designated route, maintaining secure satellite uplinks. Overhead, unmanned systems fed them live ISR. The SAS patrol cut across broken ground, using wadis and scrub lines to mask thermal exposure. Then the dust storm shifted. Wind spiked from 15 knots to 40 in under 6 minutes. Visibility collapsed to less than 50 meters. The American ISR feed flickered. Satellite communications began to degrade, signal attenuation under atmospheric interference. Inside the armored vehicles, operators watched their screens pixelate into digital snow. The plan assumed bandwidth dominance. The environment had other ideas. "Switch to secondary net," came the American team leader's call. But secondary depended on line-of-sight relays. The terrain rolled unpredictably, one ridge too high, one dip too deep, and the network fractured into silence. Inside the lead vehicle, a navigation system recalculated, then recalculated again. GPS drift minor but compounding. A 5-meter error became 15. 15 became 30. In a live fire environment, 30 meters could mean the difference between a cleared corridor and a simulated minefield. Meanwhile, the SAS patrol felt the wind differently. Dust-stung exposed skin, goggles fogged, but there were no screens to lose, no digital dependency to sever. Their primary navigation was terrain association and pace count methods older than satellites, slower perhaps in comfort, unimpressed by atmospheric interference. At A0143, the first friction point hit. The American convoy reached a narrow, choke-pointed dry river crossing with steep banks. In clear conditions, it was passable. In near-zero visibility, depth perception vanished. The lead vehicle hesitated. Thermal couldn't differentiate dust plumes from hard ground. Engineers dismounted the probe. Time bled. 9 minutes to assess, 12 to maneuver, another 7 to re-establish formation. 28 minutes lost. On the parallel axis, the SAS patrol bypassed the same obstacle entirely. They'd identified it during map reconnaissance and selected a dismounted alternate route, sacrificing comfort for certainty. By 0158, they were already within 800 meters of the objective compound. The mobility gap was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. But the decisive fracture hadn't yet revealed itself. At 024, the joint plan required synchronized pressure, Americans initiating a diversionary breach on the western perimeter, while the SAS element infiltrated from the east. Timing mattered. Surprise depended on convergence. Inside the American vehicles, comms finally stabilized barely. The dust storm thinned just enough for partial signal restoration. The order to initiate movement went out. It didn't reach everyone. One assault element, positioned in a shallow depression, remained outside effective relay range. Their radios crackled but never cleared. They waited for a green light that never came. Across the compound's perimeter, the SAS patrol leader checked his luminous dial. They were ahead of schedule. No audible diversion. No vehicle signatures. Just wind. Doctrine dictated initiative. They had conditional autonomy baked into their mission brief. If synchronization failed, exploit the window. In 2012, they moved. 2 men scaled the outer wall using compact ladders carried on their backs. No hydraulic breach, no explosive signature. Just a quiet entry under cover of storm and darkness. Inside the compound, role-players simulating hostile forces were caught mid-rotation. The first guard neutralized within 30 seconds. The command node structure reached within 4 minutes. In 2017, the SAS transmitted a low-power coded burst. Objective secure. Silence on the American net. Back at the river crossing, the final vehicle crested the bank at 0221. Assault teams dismounted into a compound already controlled by their partners. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the evaluators' voices crackled across the exercise control frequency. The timing delta was 17 minutes. In a real operational environment, 17 minutes could mean enemy reinforcements entrenched, or hostages executed, or an exfiltration corridor closed by armor. The debrief that followed was clinical, but the tension was not. American commanders pointed to force protection, redundancy, casualty mitigation through armored mobility. Their systems, when functional, provided unmatched situational awareness and firepower. The British countered with friction tolerance, environmental resilience, reduced electromagnetic signature, speed through simplicity. But the fracture widened when data analysts replayed the simulated adversary's timeline. Had the scenario continued realistically, the mechanized counterattack would have arrived at 023. Under the actual timeline, American assault elements would have been engaging enemy armor outside the compound while still attempting to breach. Casualty projections spiked by 35% in the modeled outcome. The SAS element already inside would have exfiltrated before contact. This wasn't about who was braver or better trained. Both units operated at the highest global standard. It was about equipment philosophy shaping tactical reality. The Americans had optimized for information dominance. The SAS had optimized for independence from it. One side assumed connectivity, the other assumed its absence. As the sun rose over the plateau, the dust settled into thin layers across vehicles and kit alike. The armored platforms looked imposing, scarred by abrasive wind but intact. The SAS patrol sat quietly, rehydrating, their equipment already stripped down and repacked with minimal ceremony. An American staff officer, reviewing telemetry logs, muttered a single phrase that would echo long after the exercise concluded. "We engineered ourselves into a corner." Not because the technology failed, it had performed within expected parameters, but because doctrine had grown intertwined with assumptions about uncontested bandwidth and predictable environments. The fracture was systemic. In follow-on drills over the next 48 hours, adjustments were attempted. Americans trialed lighter assault configurations. The British experimented with integrating additional digital feeds. Performance gaps narrowed but never fully closed. The real cost wasn't measured in simulated casualties. It was measured in institutional discomfort. For years, interoperability had been discussed as a matter of shared tactics and compatible radios. This exercise revealed something deeper: compatibility of mindset. In one closing simulation, both forces were forced to exfiltrate under compressed timelines. The SAS element abandoned non-essential equipment without hesitation, cutting weight to increase speed. An American team debated whether to retain a damaged but expensive seat. 30 seconds passed. In live combat, 30 seconds is eternity. The evaluators recorded it without comment. When the final hot wash concluded, no one declared a winner. Official language emphasized lessons learned, synergistic opportunities, capability integration. But beneath the bureaucratic phrasing, something had shifted. The Americans recognized that resilience sometimes means subtraction, not addition. The SAS acknowledged that selective technology, when stripped of dependency, could amplify reach without anchoring mobility. Neither side anticipated that a dust storm would become the most decisive participant, and yet it was the wind, the uncontrollable variable, that exposed the fracture. Because when the network flickered and the terrain swallowed signals, doctrine was laid bare. Equipment choices became fate, assumptions became risks, and in those 17 minutes of silence between phase line echo and the compound breach, two philosophies collided, not in theory, but in dust, delay, and consequence. The reckoning wasn't explosive, it was quieter than that. It was the realization that in modern warfare, superiority is not just measured in capability, but in what you can still accomplish when capability falters. Neither side would leave unchanged, and neither would forget the night the wind chose the winner. The first American response to the criticism was simple: dismiss it. Behind secure doors at the Pentagon, briefings reduced the controversy to tone. British exceptionalism, cultural friction, different theaters, different budgets. The official position was calm, rational, controlled. The United States fielded the most advanced military in human history. Its special operations forces operated across 70 countries at any given time. Its procurement system produced night vision so advanced it turned darkness into daylight. Its radios could reach satellites from mountain valleys. Its body armor could stop rifle rounds at close range. On paper, there was nothing to fix, but paper doesn't kick doors, and paper doesn't bleed in stairwells. In a team room at Fort Bragg, long before the controversy ever reached media channels, a Delta troop had already started making quiet changes. The war lockers still carried standard issue loadouts for inspection: plates, side plates, throat protectors, mandated pouch configurations, radio redundancies. It looked immaculate during briefings. It looked different before missions. Extra plates disappeared first. Then non-essential pouches, backup systems deemed redundant by operators who knew exactly how much redundancy was survivable and how much was crippling. A fully loaded American assault kit in the mid-2000s could push 90 pounds with water, ammunition, armor, breaching tools, and comms. 90 pounds climbing 3 flights of concrete stairs in 120-degree heat was not theoretical weight. It was oxygen debt. It was a tremor in the forearms. It was half seconds lost at thresholds. Half seconds gross to thresholds. Half seconds get people killed. Some Delta operators had worked alongside the SAS in Iraq. They had seen the stripped-down rigs, plate carriers cut to essentials, ammunition positioned for speed, not symmetry, radios configured for practicality, not procurement compliance, no ornamental bulk, no bureaucratic padding. The British philosophy was simple: survive by speed, not by weight. And quietly, some Americans agreed. The friction wasn't tactical, it was institutional. The Pentagon's procurement system was built on standardization. Standardization meant interoperability. Interoperability meant scale. Scale meant contracts, massive ones. Multi-year, multi-billion-dollar programs justified by threat assessments, congressional oversight, and industrial-based stability. Equipment wasn't just gear, it was a political economy. District jobs, defense contractor stock performance, strategic supply chains. You could not simply strip down a standardized system without admitting it had been overbuilt. And overbuilt systems have sponsors. In Virginia Beach, within naval special warfare circles, a similar fracture was forming. Some SEAL platoons, particularly those rotating through high-threat urban environments, began modifying their kits between inspections and deployment. They ran lighter plate carriers, reduced admin pouches, slimmed hydration systems, ammunition redistributed for balance and immediate access, slimmed hydration systems, ammunition redistributed for balance and immediate access. Unofficially, they studied Israeli and British approaches to urban counter-terror operations. Speed through doorways, aggressive entry angles, reduced fatigue during multi-hour clearance operations. One former operator would later describe the shift in quiet terms. You can either carry everything that might save you, or you can move fast enough that you don't need it. The math was brutal. A 10-pound reduction in load translated into measurable improvements in sprint time over 20 meters, in heart rate stabilization after breaching, in muzzle steadiness during rapid target acquisition, in stairwell acceleration. It wasn't a theory, it was physiology, yet recommending official changes came at a cost. Inside professional military education channels, officers who questioned standardized kit doctrine found themselves labeled as disruptive. Procurement programs already funded were politically immovable. Billions, allocated years in advance, could not pivot because a handful of operators preferred minimalist rigs. Risk mitigation arguments always favored more protection, more redundancy, more technology. No career ever stalled because an operator carried too much armor. But careers could stall for publicly implying the institution had miscalculated. The divide wasn't loud, it was subterranean. At the operator level, pragmatism ruled. At the institutional level, risk optics ruled. If a soldier died without side plates that had been authorized but not warm, the inquiry would be ruthless. If a soldier died under excessive load that slowed reaction time, the causality would be murkier. Harder to quantify, easier to defend bureaucracy, so some Americans adapted quietly. In Ramadi, a joint operation saw Delta and SAS units clearing parallel sectors. American operators moved lighter than their own official guidance suggested. The difference was visible in motion. Where conventional units advanced methodically, burdened by gear and layered oversight, the stripped teams flowed room to room with predatory rhythm. Weapons up, breathing controlled. Minimal wasted movement. Speed created dominance. Dominance created psychological shock. Shock shortened engagements. After-action metrics rarely captured that nuance. They recorded objectives secured, enemy neutralized, friendly casualties. They did not record seconds shaved off breach to clear cycles. They did not quantify fatigue avoided on the 5th target building of the night. But the operators felt it in their knees, in their lower backs, in their reaction times at 0300 hours. Back in Washington, debates framed the issue differently. American forces operated globally, across climates from the Arctic to the jungle. Standardization simplified logistics. A universal kit reduced training variability. It allowed rapid force generation. All true. But special operations were never designed to be universal. They were designed to be exceptional. The deeper tension was philosophical. Was the purpose of elite units to model compliance or to optimize lethality? Could a system built for millions of service members truly serve the few hundred tasked with the most complex missions on Earth? Some within U.S. Special Operations Command quietly pushed for modular doctrine baseline standards with operator discretion. They cited allied practices. They referenced empirical performance differences. They spoke carefully, often in classified forums, and some paid. Promotions slowed. Command opportunities narrowed. Reputation in tight-knit communities carries weight. Being labeled non-standard in a culture that values discipline can isolate even the most competent leader. The irony was sharp. The same institution that celebrated innovation in public speeches resisted it internally when innovation implied institutional overreach. This was never simply America versus Britain. It was operators versus architecture. On one side, men who measured effectiveness in heartbeats, angles, and ounces. On the other, a machine designed to manage scale, optics, and political consequence. And somewhere between them was the truth. Because the Americans who agreed with the SAS were not rejecting their own military. They were protecting it from inefficiency, from inertia, from the slow creep of over-engineering that confuses safety with survivability. By the late years of the Iraq War, incremental shifts began appearing. Lighter plate carrier programs, increased operator customization, greater tolerance for mission-specific loadouts, not because of public criticism, not because of headlines, but because inside the machine, enough practitioners had quietly demonstrated that less could be more. They never held press conferences. They never framed it as validation of British critique. They simply moved faster. And in special operations, speed is a form of truth. There is a moment that never makes it into official reports. It happens after the patrol, after the dust settles, after the radio traffic fades into silence. A soldier sits on his bunk, turning a piece of issued equipment over in his hands. The polymer still smells faintly of cordite and sun-baked plastic. He is not thinking about heroism. He is not thinking about medals. He is thinking about a name, a face, a split second when something failed, or almost failed, and the realization that it did not have to. This is the part of war that doctrine rarely records. Because being right in the military can be dangerous, not tactically, institutionally. Modern Western militaries, from the regimental traditions of the British Army to the sprawling bureaucratic architecture of the United States Army, are built on hierarchy. Authority flows downward. Equipment decisions flow from procurement boards, defense ministries, congressional committees, and industrial partners who have spent billions ensuring the machine runs as designed. To challenge a weapon system is not merely to critique an object. It is to question a chain of decisions that may stretch back a decade. It is to imply that someone, somewhere, signed off on something imperfect. And imperfection inside institutions that prize control is uncomfortable. In a briefing room, dissent sounds like insubordination. In a patrol base, dissent can sound like survival. There is an unspoken rule among operators: you adapt quietly. You tape over flaws. You swap components unofficially. You buy better gear with your own money. You modify within tolerances. You make it work. And you do not embarrass the system that issued it to you. Because the system also writes your evaluations. Promotion boards do not measure courage by how loudly you criticize procurement policy. They measure cohesion, loyalty, professional bearing. A captain who sends formal complaints about a standard issue optic may be correct and still find his file subtly cooling in future review cycles. No memo will say why. It never does. The culture of silence is not enforced with overt threats. It is maintained through career gravity, through sideways glances, through the quiet advice of a senior NCO who pulls a young lieutenant aside and says, "Be careful how you word that." And yet, History shows us something uncomfortable. The most effective warriors are often the ones who break patterns. They are the ones who question the angle of a grip, the reliability of a magazine, the ergonomics of a sight. They are the ones who look at doctrine and ask whether it fits the ground beneath their boots. They do not do it because they are rebellious. They do it because they have carried a body, and that weight changes a man's relationship with procedure. In both Iraq and Afghanistan, small pockets of soldiers on both sides of the Atlantic began quietly adjusting their equipment loadouts when reality diverged from training manuals. Some requested alternate optics. Some sourced different ancillary gear. Some modified carry methods that contradicted standardized instruction. None of these changes were dramatic. No mutiny. No manifesto. Just incremental corrections made under fire. But here is the ethical paradox. If a soldier alters equipment without authorization and something goes wrong, he alone bears the blame. If he does not alter it and suspects the standard issue is flawed and something goes wrong, he must live with that knowledge. That is a moral crucible. Inside elite units, where performance margins are razor-thin, this paradox sharpens. Operators are selected precisely because they can see problems early. They are trained to adapt faster than the enemy, yet they operate inside institutions that cannot pivot at the same speed. So the question becomes how much deviation is loyalty, how much is betrayal, and who decides? Consider psychological math. A platoon leader observes a recurring malfunction under specific environmental conditions: dust intrusion, extreme heat, fine sand clogging moving parts. He reports it. The chain acknowledges receipt. Months pass. No change. He now faces a choice before every patrol. Trust the system or quietly hedge against it. Every time he signs for that equipment, he is signing an invisible waiver with his own conscience. The burden compounds when casualties enter the equation. In private conversations, never recorded, never public, veterans have wrestled with a haunting thought: if we had been allowed different equipment, would that have changed the outcome? It is not an accusation. It is a question that moops at 3 in the morning. Institutional inertia is rarely malicious. Procurement cycles span years. Testing protocols demand data. Political oversight slows adaptation. Industrial contracts bind timelines. Armies cannot pivot like startups. But insurgents do not care about procurement calendars. They exploit gaps immediately. And the soldier on patrol lives in the gap between decision and implementation. There is also social risk. Within tightly bonded units, criticizing issued gear can feel like criticizing leadership itself. Younger soldiers look upward for cues. If their sergeant publicly challenges equipment, does that signal weakness, distrust, or does it model critical thinking? The line is thin. Too much dissent fractures cohesion. Too little breeds quiet resentment. And so many choose the middle path: compliance outwardly, modification privately, tape-wrapped here, aftermarket purchase there, a small shift in how something is carried or deployed. Adjustments made not in defiance, but in stewardship of the men beside them. This is not a glamorous rebellion. It is an administrative risk taken for tactical certainty. There is a cost to that, too. The stress of operating in two realities, the official and the practical, creates cognitive friction. Soldiers become adept at navigating dual languages, what is written and what works. Over time, that duality can harden into cynicism, or in some cases into a sharper form of professionalism, one that understands institutions are imperfect, yet still worth serving. The moral complexity is this: militaries depend on discipline to function, but they depend on adaptive minds to win. The same officer who questions a procurement choice may also be the one who saves lives through unorthodox thinking. The same NCO who files a blunt equipment report may later train a generation of soldiers more honestly because he refused to pretend. Effectiveness often lives just outside the boundary of regulation, and those who step into that space carry invisible weight, not just the weight of potential career stagnation, not just the quiet conversations in closed offices, but the deeper weight of responsibility. The knowledge that if they are right and no one listens, someone else might pay for it. That is the burden of professional honesty in war. It does not earn headlines, it does not trend, but inside barracks rooms, inside patrol bases, inside the minds of men and women who have tested doctrine against gunfire, it lingers. Being right can isolate you. Being right can isolate you. Being silent can haunt you. And somewhere between those two extremes, the most effective warriors make a choice, not about gear, not about pride, but about what kind of professional they are willing to be. Because in the end, the fight is never just against the enemy. Sometimes it is against complacency. Sometimes it is against momentum. And sometimes it is against the quiet, suffocating comfort of believing that standard issue is the same thing as optimal. The human cost of that belief is not measured in procurement budgets. It is measured in memory.